We all got claws. I ain't impressed.
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So those of you who have been following my channel will know that recently I've been reviewing several games in the X-Men series. In my last review I looked at X2 Wolverine's Revenge from 2003, which was technically a tie-in for the X-Men 2 movie that was released alongside it, though the game actually had its own original story. Today we're going to be looking at the tie-in for X-Men 3, X-Men the Official Game, released in 2006, developed by Underground Development. I actually own two versions of this game. I have the original Xbox version and the Xbox 360 version. Both versions are practically identical, with the only major difference being that the 360 version has slightly better graphics and can be played in HD. Other than that, it's practically the same game. The version I'm reviewing is the 360 version. So as I mentioned before, X-Men the Official Game is technically a tie-in for the X-Men 3 movie, or X-Men The Last Stand. However, just like all the X-Men movie tie-ins, this game doesn't follow the story of the movie. However, unlike the previous movie tie-ins, this game actually does take place in the movie's continuity. Although what I will say is it's unclear whether or not the game is actually canon. The game's story takes place shortly after the events of X-Men 2, and prior to the events of X-Men 3, and it serves to try and explain what happened in between the two movies. Since in X-Men 3 there were so many things that were never explained, such as what happened to Nightcrawler. He played a predominant role in X-Men 2, and wasn't even mentioned in the third movie. Also, when did Beast show up and suddenly rejoin the X-Men? The game does its best to explain these questions.
You're leaving.
I am not suited for this life, Professor. I am a simple man.
Our doors are always open to you.
The reason I'm not sure if the game is canon, however, is because it's clear that some pretty major stuff happens in the game that is never mentioned or even alluded to in the movies, such as the return of the Sentinels, the reveal of Hydra, also returning characters such as Jason Stryker, Sabretooth and Deathstrike. These seem like pretty major story developments, and they are nowhere to be seen in X-Men 3, but I digress. The game is a third-person action-adventure game where you play as three characters from the X-Men movies. The characters you play as are Wolverine, Iceman and Nightcrawler. I mentioned before the game takes place shortly after the events of X-Men 2. Once the X-Men have recovered from the nightmare events that took place at Alkali Lake, they are attempted to do some major damage control. Beast is appointed as a negotiator for the government to help improve human and mutant relations. Also, Magneto is on the run after trying to genocide the whole of humanity, like an absolute psychopath. Yeah, the movie version of Magneto is a madman, but I digress. And Charles Xavier is attempting to find him using Cerebro. The game begins with a tutorial level where Wolverine is training in the Danger Room. This gives you an introduction into the game's overall controls and combat. You also get a short boss battle against Sabretooth here. Once the tutorials are over, Charles Xavier realizes that he needs some of the Cerebro components that were left at Alkali Lake, so that he can use them to find Magneto. This means the X-Men will have to return to Alkali Lake.
Many of the components Stryker removed were irreplaceable.
And we left those parts back at...
Alkali Lake.
That's right. I realize Alkali Lake holds difficult memories for us all.
When returning there, they run into the shady military faction known as Hydra, who are attempting to salvage something from the old Weapon X facility. They then uncover a conspiracy involving the Sentinels and their leader Master Mold. Also, you learn pretty early in the game that Jason Stryker survived the events of X-Men 2, and is using his telepathic powers to control the Sentinels and take revenge on the X-Men. So yes, a pretty interesting plot with some pretty major events. As far as the overall gameplay, the game basically has three separate modes. You have Wolverine's levels, which are purely action based. These are basically hack and slash levels where you cut your way through hordes and hordes of enemies and get from one end of the level to the other. The combat of the game is actually pretty fun and quite nuanced. Wolverine will be able to strike enemies with a variety of attacks. You have light attacks and heavy attacks, and you can mix these up in combinations. You can also pull off several special moves such as kicks and knockback attacks, and you can stun enemies by using a headbutt. This is quite fun to do. You can also perform jump attacks, and this can help you defeat enemies who have long range attacks. You actually get quite a bit of enemy variety in the game. You mostly take on soldiers of various kinds. The main enemy faction of the game is Hydra. Some of these soldiers use guns and ranged attacks, however most of them use melee attacks, and some of these are considerably tougher and more effective in combat than others. Later in the game you even take on these quick, flashy ninja type enemies.
Your success has come to an end, hero. For now you fight the wind.
Wolverine also has a healing factor where you can heal your health while not in combat. It's wise to do this before you approach enemies or enter the next area of a level. There are some areas where you're basically allowed to do this before the next fight, and I'd recommend taking advantage of it. He also has a rage meter that fills as he takes damage and strikes enemies. Once the rage meter fills, he can then enter rage mode, which makes your melee attacks significantly more powerful and also rapidly increases your healing factor. Iceman's levels are completely different. His levels are basically on-rails flying simulators. You basically fly around the levels, surfing through the air, like Iceman does in the comics, and blasting enemies with ice attacks, as well as putting out fires and generally saving lives. Some of his levels have a time limit and you will basically need to reach a certain area quickly to prevent some kind of disaster. And you even have some pretty cool aerial combat sections. Iceman's levels are also a lot more fast paced, and there seem to always be a lot going on in them, and he seemed to always be surrounded by chaos. And yeah, there's always a lot of urgency in them. Iceman's abilities include an ice beam. This can be used to put out fires, as well as to freeze water and certain items. It can also be used in combat to defeat enemies. He also has a projectile attack. These are called hailstorms. These can be fired at enemies to defeat them. Though I personally found the ice beam to be significantly more effective against most enemies, but I digress. Iceman also has an ice shield that can be used to block enemy projectile attacks, and can also be used to pass through certain hazards unscathed, which you may need to do at some point if moving fast, since you might not be able to get out of the way in time. Iceman also has a passive healing ability called Ice Healing. His levels are a lot of fun and I really enjoyed them. Nightcrawler's levels are my personal favourite in the whole game. These levels are awesome. His levels are a mix between combat, platforming and stealth. They usually include some puzzle solving and some acrobatics. What's really cool about this and what makes Nightcrawler's levels stand out in my opinion is the teleport mechanic. Nightcrawler can teleport between certain points at any time, and this is implemented into both the game's puzzle solving, platforming and combat. Teleporting around the level is an absolute blast to do, and it just makes traversing the game so much more fun than the other levels. You can kick and punch enemies during combat, and even perform several pretty cool and badass combinations. Pulling these combinations off does take a bit of skill, but it's very fun. And once you master the combat and learn to exploit the AI a bit, it becomes an absolute blast to do. Really fun combat. You can even teleport away from enemies if they begin to overwhelm you, and hide, before attacking them from a vantage point. You can also teleport directly behind enemies and start spamming punches and kicks on them, attacking before they even know you're there. This is badass. One thing I remember thinking back when I first played this game is how great would it have been if the developers had had more time and a bigger budget in the future to make a solo Nightcrawler game based on the gameplay style of his levels from this game. I mean, that could have been awesome, and it would have been interesting to see what they could have done with the concept, but I digress. Nightcrawler isn't as durable as the other two, and he can take a lot less damage, which seems consistent with the lore. He's not as tough as Wolverine or Iceman, but he's so much faster and so much more elusive and fluid. Nightcrawler also has his own healing ability, called Shadow Aura, where he basically has to stand still and disappear while his health replenishes. This can only be done while not in combat, just like Wolverine. Sometimes you will need to do this if you get overwhelmed in combat, since it's very difficult to fight multiple enemies at once. So yeah, Nightcrawler's levels are an absolute blast to play, and they were my personal favourite levels in the whole game. Having these 3 playable characters was a great idea, since it really does its bit to add some variety to the game. The game's overall level design is pretty interesting. A large portion of the early part of the game takes place in Alkali Lake, at the abandoned Weapon X facility, while Wolverine and Storm attempt to find out what Hydra's up to. Nightcrawler and Colossus go to get the Cerebro components for Xavier. Later in the game, the team kinda splits up and goes their own way. Wolverine travels to Japan, and these levels are pretty badass. Nightcrawler heads to the Brooklyn Bridge to stop Multiple Man, and Iceman heads to a nuclear power plant to stop Pyro. The game culminates in a bunch of levels that take place in Hong Kong, where the team regroup to stop the Master Mold and the Sentinels from destroying the world. There is actually quite a bit of variety in terms of the levels themselves, and the things you have to do. Some of them even have each character face their own personal demons, while Jason Stryker attempts to drive them mad with illusions.
I know your secrets, your fears.
No, stop. You're scaring me.
The game also has a pretty good leveling up system. As you play through the game and complete levels, you will unlock gene points. These points can be added to various attributes at the end of each level. You will earn more gene points from the level depending on the difficulty setting you choose. Completing the level on the hardest difficulty will earn you the most amount of points. It's a pretty simple leveling up system and I like the way it was done. You can improve each power individually this way, making your attacks much more effective, and even improving your health and healing abilities, which as I mentioned before each character has. This of course adds to the replay value, since if a level is too hard to complete on the hardest difficulty, you can instead complete it on an easier one, and return later once you have leveled up enough to make it easier for you. I really liked the game's leveling up system. It was simple and wasn't too steep a learning curve. In some levels you will have some help from an NPC. In a couple of levels you will be assisted by Storm, who can cast lightning attacks at enemies when you order her to. This can really help when you're surrounded by multiple enemies, as you can take several of them out at once. Be sure to use this ability to your advantage. And in one level you're assisted by Colossus, where you have to protect him. This helped to add a bit of variety to the game also. And I really did enjoy these levels. The game's AI is pretty good for the time also. The game also has several pretty epic boss battles, and this is one of the best things about the game in my opinion. Way better than the boss battles in Wolverine's Revenge, as far as I'm concerned. Each character has their own specific bosses to defeat. For example, as Wolverine, you take on Sabretooth on 2 occasions, Lady Deathstrike, who you also fight twice, and Silver Samurai. These boss battles are awesome. As Nightcrawler you take on Multiple Man, who is attempting to blow up the Brooklyn Bridge. As Iceman you have a huge battle with Pyro, that takes place across multiple levels. Pyro has basically taken over a huge nuclear power plant, and is attempting to carry out a mission for Magneto. Iceman will have to put out the fires, and prevent Pyro from destroying the plant, causing a nuclear meltdown. The levels culminate in a huge battle against a giant fire serpent that Pyro controls. This is so much more badass than the Pyro vs Iceman fight from the movie. Imagine if the movie was like the game. If it was more like this it would have been more memorable, but I digress. You also take on several of these giant sentinels. This is pretty cool. So yeah, the game's boss battles are really good and really fun. So yeah, the game's overall combat, level design, leveling up system and boss battles are all pretty cool. And I don't really have any serious criticisms for it. One thing that I did find a bit bizarre was the game's cutscenes. Rather than using regular animated cutscenes, the game instead uses these somewhat photorealistic stills, with the characters narrating over them. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I just would have preferred regular cutscenes. Some of them involve Professor Charles Xavier and Beast discussing the events of the game, and planning what to do.
It has shielding that is resisting even our most advanced tracking systems.
God help us all.
The game has some authenticity, with several of the voice actors from the movies reprising their roles for the game. I appreciate this, since it helps to connect the story with the movie, since they are technically supposed to take place in the same continuity. In addition to all this, the game has some collectibles and several pretty interesting bonus features. The game has an unlockable danger room mission for each playable character. These are unlocked by simply completing a certain act of the game's story. You also have several unlockable costumes. Each character has 2 alternative costumes to unlock, a street costume and a comic costume. You can unlock these by finding Sentinel Tech and Weapon X files hidden in each level. There are 5 Sentinel Techs and 1 Weapon X file per level. These are usually quite easy to find, though some of them are hidden in obscure locations. If you do happen to miss any, then you can replay the levels to find them. The street costume for each character is one of their alternate costumes from the movies, such as Wolverine's vest and jeans, and Nightcrawler's outfit from the opening of X-Men 2. And you also have one of their classic comic costumes, such as Wolverine's classic yellow and blue suit. These look great, and you guys know I really appreciate features like these in games, and it's awesome to see them included. One criticism I do have of the game, however, is the game is very short, and can be completed in just a few hours, though there is plenty of replay value since you have several different difficulty settings for each level, an upgrade system, and some unlockable costumes. But still, I do think the game could have been a bit longer, and maybe could have had a slightly more satisfying ending, because there are some great ideas here, but the game just feels a bit anticlimactic, and lacking in overall content. But nonetheless, the game is great, and I had an absolute blast playing it, despite its shortcomings. The game's graphics and presentation are also great for 2006, and the character models look fantastic. The soundtrack is pretty good too, with the game's main theme being the main theme from X-Men 2. And the Danger Room level, I noticed, even has some music from X-Men Legends. I give X-Men the official game a solid 8 out of 10, which I think is a fair score. Thanks for watching, guys. I really enjoyed replaying and reviewing X-Men the official game. Stay tuned for my next video, where we're going to be looking at X-Men Origins Wolverine, the movie license game. I'm really looking forward to reviewing that game. Let me know what you guys think. Stay tuned for more content. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future, as well as some more character profiles. Thanks for watching, and God bless.
Goodbye.
Auf Wiedersehen.